I am delighted to introduce our next speaker, who is joining us online today. Michael Runningwolf is going to speak on the First Languages AI Reality Initiative. Michael was raised in a rural village in Montana with intermittent water and electricity. Naturally, he has a Master's of Science in Computer Science and is a former engineer on a product you may have used called Alexa. He's also a former faculty member at Northeastern University and is currently pursuing his PhD in computer science at McGill. Michael is researching Indigenous language and cultural reclamation using immersive technologies and artificial intelligence. His work has been awarded the MIT Solve Fellowship, the Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship, and the Patrick McGovern AI for Humanity Prize. Through the ethical application of AI and advanced technology, respecting Indigenous ways of knowing, he is contributing to the ecology of thought represented by the Indigenous. Please join me in welcoming Michael online. Michael, welcome. Over to you.
My presentation, I always use this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures where these two little girls were helping each other play with one of the apps I had built years ago. And so bringing to the topic, what I'm talking about is the loss of language diversity. In North America, we have hundreds of languages here, and every color you see here is a language family, a cohesive group of languages. Some of them range from hundreds, like the gold color that dominates from the Rockies all the way to the East Coast, and around Toronto, the Great Lakes, and Maine and Boston area. That's the Algonquin language. It's the largest, and certainly largest geographically, and largest by language population in North America. And then you have other colors, like another large group is the Siouan languages, which is blue, which goes down from Alberta all the way down to Oklahoma. And like to point out, the little thing here, the white represents where languages are no longer spoken. That represents language loss. And as you kind of see, this is actually a map of manifest destiny. As you go further and further west, language diversity increases. And then you have in British Columbia, which has the majority of all languages in Canada. And you can see the high density. And I work with the languages on Vancouver Island that cross over, because languages predate the America and Canada. So these languages actually cross the border from Vancouver Island up into BC, all the way down to Washington State in the United States. And what I'm really concerned about is making sure these languages have technology that reinforces their ability to be transmitted intergenerationally. And if there's no intergenerational transmission, the language is considered endangered by UNESCO. And so to address this problem, overall, what I'll be talking about here is FLAIR, which is housed, the technical research is housed at MILA in Montreal, where I go to school, and also is alliance between Indigenous communities and language advocates here. You can see this is my mom recording Cheyenne stories and my father playing around with a VR app I had built. If you need any VR nerds out there, that's a very early Oculus Gear, very old technology nowadays. And so why are languages important? Languages just broadly encode your anthropological and your cultural and your ethnic and racial identity into them. And it encodes your worldview. The way you describe something actually it impacts the way you think about it, which is actually quite intuitive. Like, for instance, a Waukeshan language on the West Coast, Suchas, is the word for tree, which literally means landholder. So like the who has ownership of the land, it's the trees, because they literally own it. They hold it down. And that changes your perspective on how ownership rights and land management, if the owner are trees versus humans, and it affects, policy and the outlook of the culture toward the environment. And there's a technical problem. So why don't we just document, collect data, build, we have had automatic speech recognition, language AI for Western languages for decades, dating back to, the 60s and 70s, when the early hand-built pre-neural net technology, and more recently with advances like Deep Speech 2 and Whisper, and papers by OpenAI, and others, Meta's new paper. The technical problem is that fundamentally these languages in North America are not English. I used to work in industry for large, famous voice AI, and the paradigm is basically we just sort of assume that all languages are a type of English fundamentally from a mechanical standpoint, not conceptually. Like obviously there's quite a bit of difference between French, English, and German, and the peoples that speak them, but at a very deep technical level, fundamental level of how you organize these languages using statistical methods and modern state-of-the-art ASR, they are pretty similar. And linguists actually call this phenomena plain old European languages. And the core difference between indigenous languages in North America and languages in Europe or even in Asia are that it's polysynthetic, where every single word encodes as much information as a phrase does in English, meaning that polysynthesis just means poly, multiple components here. And you can see here, this is a macaw word with a literal meaning and an actual intended meaning, and it's just one word. Every word is constructed dynamically and may only ever occur once in the history of the universe. And so what do you do if you can't apply statistical methods, because often when you're typing on your phone, you notice that there's kind of the spell check kind of pushes you toward writing something. What if you don't even have a nice bell curve because it's going to be flat, because there's just infinity. You don't actually have. It would happen in a small localized sense, but not necessarily at scale that would allow to make reliable automatic speech recognition. And this has been proven by research by CRIM over in Montreal, where standard strategies just simply don't work on indigenous languages. And they did work with Inuktitut, which has a very large text corpus and audio data set. And so how do we approach this problem? To summarize the TLDR without going into too much technical detail, and I'll be happy to answer a couple of the questions at the end of my talk about this, but basically to account for one of the major two problems, number one is the languages are fundamentally different. We need a new technical solution. The second is we don't have a lot of data. Indigenous languages in North America are radically under-documented, and majority of the languages in North America, including Canada, the United States, and Mexico, don't have any documentation. They may have a few audio recordings. What does exist is most often in analog form, tape cassette, reel to reel, people just amateur, recordings of their elders. There is some fortunate languages that have systemic recordings, like the languages we're working with. But even then, we're working with data sets that are around 200 hours of audio, unannotated, unfortunately, just free, analog audio and reel to reel that needs to be digitized. And what we don't have is a large data set of annotated audio. Like when you think about the modern ASR systems, they require tens of thousands of annotated audio. That is time-aligned text corresponding to waveforms. We simply just don't have that. And so the solution to that general problem is that we're collectivizing multiple related languages that are closely related phonetically. They share similar sounds, they share morphological attributes, and then they're culturally similar. And so that if the meaning, we just de-risk the whole process. And so that's why we're focused on languages and the BC area because there's high documentation. These languages are relatively strong. We have enough sufficient speakers to data collect. And also, more importantly, quite frankly, they want to work with us. This is something they actually want to do versus a top-down research project. All this research, more importantly, comes from the community and their desire. And you can kind of think of it as kind of like a stone soup where no language can do it by themselves and all the languages must work together. And here's the team. These are the top level teams. We have communities in the Northwest Territory, the Gwich'in. We have a community, the Kwakwala community in Vancouver Island, and of course, McCall in Washington, United States. And, this is a team effort. I can't claim, nor do I really want to. I'm not a polymath genius. We have a data scientist who's an MIT alum, Caroline, who has years of nerd experience. And of course, we have our team linguist, Dr. Connor Quinn. And of course, our big partner, Mila, who is supporting the fundamental research in Montreal. And an important aspect of this research is that we need to ensure a top sovereignty of the communities we're working with. And it's something I mentioned earlier, and I really want to re-emphasize, is that the communities want this. This isn't a scientific exercise for my PhD program. The way I think of it is that the PhD is a side effect of the research. I would do the research regardless, and because it's urgent and important work, and we can't let this work not include us. There is research being conducted by large corporations, the typical FANG, and I don't want to point fingers. This is typical. All the companies, all academia, to an extent, all of academia within Canada and the United States participate in this, and also corporations participate in research that treats Indigenous peoples as a data set, treats their thoughts and their words and their histories and their perspectives as a scientific exercise in research subjects, which it's not. To the communities, this is their identity. This is how they relate to the land and who they are. And I'm very careful. I am part of my research is also ensuring that we have legal frameworks that protect the rights, the intellectual property rights of the communities. Everything we're doing is transparent. Even talking to you today, we have consulted them, made them aware that we are presenting them. So we're not making sure they're not misrepresented, because otherwise their culture, their very way of thinking can end up locked away in the Smithsonian. This is a winter count that the Lakota no longer have access to because it's locked away in a museum, and we'll probably never have access to again for the safety of the item. And just a quick recap, FLAIR is focused upon Indigenous. We are primarily an Indigenous-led. Key researchers are all Indigenous community members. All our outcomes are derived from what the communities want, what they want out of ASR research. And it's international. Languages don't respect the boundaries. The boundaries of the border are new, and these languages have been unfortunately cut. And the goal isn't technology. The goal is to restart intergenerational language transfer, to stop these languages from being endangered through the use of advanced language education tools, voice-enabled educational tools where they can practice in their home, enable distance learning, but it's not intended to supplement on-the-ground training. Most, if not all, communities in Canada have their own formal language education process. And so this is meant to holistically integrate with their existing infrastructure, and also respect their rights. This data, they are not research subjects. The data isn't mine. We're very clear that we're developing methodologies. We're going to open source the methodologies, but the data is theirs, and none of their data will be published without their express permission. And even to add to that, I usually recommend that they shouldn't, because once the data gets on the internet, gets on Hugging Face, gets on GitHub, that's it. They've lost access, they've lost sovereignty over the data. And if that's something they want, sure, but I recommend against it because it's a one-way door decision and they'll be unable to retract their data. And then more importantly, it's also to empower communities. I know I'm running out of time. I'll just real quickly, how do we, just one moment, like, how do we enable all of this? Like, it's fine that I exist, fine that I have great allies, the AI for Humanity team at Mila, and friends and allies like at the Vector Institute. But what really needs to happen is that communities need to own the research. And part of that is that for the past 2 years, I've been working on this project where we teach Lakota kids how to do AI, because who better to ensure the safety and to guide the community research than the community members themselves. And this, I'm going to flash through this real quickly, so sorry about that. Technical difficulties. I'm going to keep you guys on time. What we basically do is we have the kids to take high schoolers with no formal background in computer science and have them collect data on the field, Lakota plants, use the data that they collected and create novel models. The models for indigenous plants don't really exist. AI models, deep neural nets. It's mostly focused on interesting, artwork and whatnot. And giving them the equipment and the tools necessary to accomplish that, including hardware like laptops and whatnot, but also the tool tech stack. And I'm a former industry engineer, so I just use industry tools. I didn't bother to learn those tools like Scratch and whatnot. I told them Docker, taught them how to use Git push pull and checking the code, code reviews and all that. And we all centered all the logic around Jupyter, which gives a nice interface. And together, hopefully, the idea being that FLAIR acts as an attractor, because all communities in North America are worried about the safety of their language. And so if we're having research like FLAIR, that will cause innovation, incentivize communities to pursue these technologies, and also at the same time do a pincer movement and also make sure that the communities have the ability to participate, through trainings like this. And hopefully the next phase now is that it works. You can kind of say that these code camps are prototypes of the future, and one day they will basically become language code camps. Where we're teaching them how to build automatic speech recognition for themselves and take ownership of the research that I'm conducting. So it's not just me. I don't want to be the bottleneck. I don't want to be a gatekeeper. This research needs to be community oriented and community owned. Like, who best to do the ethical research than the community themselves? And if you want to know any further information, here's the links. The left link is the First Languages AI Reality website, and then the Lakota AI Code Camp. And I guess I'll stop there. And I don't know if you want, depending upon the organizers, if you want to give QA or not. I'm happy either way.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. Do you have a couple of minutes for questions?
Sure, I have time. I'm just worried about you guys.
Why don't we see about 2 questions? I'm going to start down here. Are there any questions on the floor for Michael? We have a couple of mics. We've got a question over here. Michael, just let us know if you can hear okay. We are having some challenges on the stage with the questions, so hopefully you can hear them just fine online.
Yeah, or you can just repeat them, just in case.
Pardon me?
Just repeat the question, since you have the mic.
Okay.
Great. Can you hear me? Is everything okay?
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, you can hear me? Okay, perfect. So much of the research that you talked about here centered on, the community, the individual, the people that you were trying to do this work for. And I feel like often that is not a prime, directive or goal of other research, other work in machine learning, in data science, whatnot. What lessons have you come across that you think the wider research or industrial communities can take from some of the work that you're doing in keeping the individuals and communities at the center of their work?
I think of the data creators as your collaborators, as your partners. often, like a lot of language AI research comes out of computational linguistics, which in turn comes from linguistics, which again, that is to say, just the type of anthropology. And when you really kind of dive deep into the language NLP fields, this concept of data originates in anthropology, and anthropology fundamentally is biased toward the Western viewpoint. Like what is in anthropology, and you read all the papers in which I have, it just sort of says, what is the baseline? The baseline is a upper class English man. Not Scottish, not Welsh, not Irish, English. And that is the viewpoint of science. You know, like all these, the research of anthropology is centered around an English-speaking Englishman, specifically ethnicity of English. And from that viewpoint, that kind of pervades. Everyone else are the weirdos, and so we're going to research them. And then from that tradition, you have this research into languages, which kind of others the speakers of these languages. And so you have in academia this tendency to just focus on the errata, the interesting structures, the morphology, phonemes, and to change the paradigm, like just see them as humans. They're not others. They're not, we speakers of other languages are humans as well. And you certainly probably are not an English person. Who from the Victorian era, and just I think it's just to humanize the data points, like to conceptualize that every single data point in which you're working with, there's a human behind it, and do they really want to participate in what you're trying to do?
Thank you for that. One more question. Is there another question in the room? I actually have a question for you, Michael. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified the protection and renewal of Indigenous languages as a key call to action. And earlier this morning, some of our panelists were talking about what the world is going to look like in 2100. So fast forward, 75 years. With your FLAIR initiative, what do you envision the futures of Indigenous peoples might be with your efforts to renew and protect Indigenous languages in 2100? What do you think that could look like?
At present, well, I'll start with the dark and I'll end with the positive. So at present rate, within the next 10 to 20 years, we'll probably have very few Indigenous languages in North America. We'll probably only have a handful at present course, unfortunately. That's the likely outcome. The communities are heroically working to preserve their data, to preserve their culture, and transmit it to the community, but there's just a lot of friction. For instance, the voice AI. So one day the metaverse is going to become more endemic, or even just communicating on social media. You need to do it in English or French or German or Spanish. And you only have these kind of technologies, natural language processing for the top 12 languages in the world, Western languages and languages like Mandarin. That leaves out 7,000 languages in the world. So it's very likely from a global scale, we'll only have probably a few hundred languages. Like we're on track for that. In the next 10 to 20 years, we'll just have very little language diversity in the world. We'll just only have a handful of critical languages, and even those hundreds that will survive going forward, they will be left out of the technology. And that's sort of the vision of FLAIR, trying to address that problem. Like how, because if we're not careful, these will become a tool of colonization and an erasure, where if you can't actually use technology in your own language, then you have to adopt another language, and that's going to normalize. Like you even see this on the macro scale of English or French. Voice technology is eliminating dialects of English in the United States and in Canada and in Europe, and also with French and German. Like anywhere voice technology emerges, the dialects start to almost get erased, and because it affects the way children speak. Because if you're trying to speak through Siri, you have to speak a certain way, and you have to account for the limitations of the technology. And so FLAIR's idea is like, why don't we flip that? Why don't we create technology for the least represented languages, the languages that are most endangered, and in doing so, enable more accessible technology for languages that have 100,000 speakers. Because there are, language loss isn't just an indigenous problem in North America, it's a European problem. There are over a dozen types of German. It's kind of blow your mind there. And all of them are going extinct. Like my wife is half German, her tribe, the Swedish, in Stuttgart, where they build Porsches and they build Audis, very, very productive people. Their language is going extinct because the official German is being imposed upon the rest of them, and there's just these small clusters of German villages who are trying to hold on to the languages, and so that's going to erase them. And so what if there was technology that allowed you to create voice AI with very small data sets with very low barriers to entry, and this will enable a future where not just North American languages, but also this will paradigm shift languages in Africa and Asia where we don't have, what about the other 7,000 languages that aren't represented in technology? And so my hope is, and if everything goes well, I don't expect FLAIR to do it single-handedly, but I'm hoping that we inspire peers, we identify peers. I'm sure people are doing similar research, we just don't know about it. Quite frankly, there's a lot of research in South America because of the Spanish-English language barrier. We just don't really hear about it. There's also language going on in research in Africa. My hope is that if we collectively begin building technology akin to what TensorFlow has done for AI, like PyTorch and TensorFlow and other, has basically lowered the barrier of entry for AI. So it's actually something you don't need a lab to do. You don't need to be Mila. You don't need to be University of Toronto to do AI. Now you just need a decent computer. And I want to do the same thing for automatic speech recognition technology so that anyone could do it in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. I believe you're accepting an award, which has taken you somewhere south of the border, so congratulations. And we really appreciated your talk. It was fascinating. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Yeah. And thank you for the opportunity.